Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about a very specific subset of American Romanticism known as Transcendentalism. And Transcendentalism was its own particular format of Romanticism, and it was this literary and philosophical movement that we saw in the United States from around the 1830s up through about the 1860s. Now, this quote is from one of the Transcendentalist poets known as Walt Whitman, one of my personal favorites. I love Walt Whitman, he's wonderful. But if you read through the quote, you'll see a little bit of a preview of some of the thoughts of the Transcendentalists. If you want to know what Transcendentalism is, you can start by taking a look at the word transcend. And if you break that down a little bit, it's a verb that means to go above or to go beyond. And that could be actually a physical thing where you're actually taking a journey, or in the case of the Transcendentalists, it was more of a symbolic idea of letting your thoughts or belief go above and beyond. And specifically, it meant sort of moving beyond the common experience and understanding to something else that was out there over and above. The literary movement of the Transcendentalists was shaped by Romanticism and also by some of the Western and the Eastern religion and philosophies, which were just really starting to make their way into this fledgling United States. And these ideas really question and kind of challenge the status quo about the way we've been taught to think about life and about each other. And it became not just a way of writing, but also a way of action and a way of life. Now, Transcendentalism meant that the idea that if you wanted to discover the reality of life, the universe, and everything, that you had to go beyond the everyday human experience in the physical world and actually find this more spiritual connection. And this was also based on romantic ideas, that you would find these connections through nature, that your own personal experience was very important, that each individual person had to do this for themselves. So you see some of those romanticism elements translating into Transcendentalism. Okay, so we know that the Transcendentalists were also romantic. So what made them different? Well, the idea of Transcendentalism as a small subset was the idea that there's this direct connection between the universe and each individual's human soul. And that by thinking about objects in nature, experiencing nature in the natural life, people can actually transcend the natural world and discover this union with what Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the founders of Transcendentalism, called the oversoul. And the oversoul was this sort of exactly what it sounds like, what would be above and beyond. Think of this sort of dome or umbrella over your soul, over the whole universe. And the ideas were to follow your intuition and follow your beliefs, no matter how much they were different from the social norms. If you ever heard that expression about, the beat of a different drummer, that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. And we'll talk about that and that quote in him a little bit later on in this unit. And they also had this idea that all people are inherently good, and that because everyone is inherently good, that we're all equal, that I can't be better than you, you can't be better than I am, we just all have our individual experiences. And that actually began to extend, as you see with the abolitionists, into this idea that slavery was wrong, very early proponents of this, and that everyone was equally deserving of the same opportunities and the same chances to explore life and the universe and everything. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the Transcendentalists. The two most famous are Emerson and Thoreau. Ralph Waldo Emerson was kind of the father of Transcendentalism. He was a former minister, which is probably not surprising given that we see all of these religious kind of connections and spirituality connections in Transcendentalism. And then Henry David Thoreau, who was his friend and kind of his pupil as well, who actually started as the son of a pencil maker, kind of dropped out of society to live this solitary life and try to follow these sorts of beliefs. So Emerson led this philosophical music movement that was centered just around the outside of Boston area, and had his house was called the Old Manse, and this became this kind of meeting ground, sort of the central location where all of these great minds and authors of the time would gather and have these deep philosophical late night conversations and read each other's writings and talk about the meaning of life. You'll notice a lot of Emerson's quotes, and we're going to take a look at some of them. Things like, hitch your wagon to a star, do not go where the path may lead, but instead go where there is no path and leave a trail. And Emerson's the one, as far as we can tell, that first coined this term, the oversoul. And then there's Henry David Thoreau, who has he's got a lot of famous stuff, but the two things you're probably going to be most familiar with is Civil Disobedience and Walden Pond. Walden Pond in particular is this time where he decided to see just exactly how simply a man can live. And this was a place, again, in Massachusetts. I've actually been there. And if you go there, you can see this sign is up here in the woods. It says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." And he built this tiny little house and tried to live, just this idea of simplify, to live as absolutely simply as possible in connection and commune with nature. And he wrote all about what this experience was like. Now, there are several other authors who are also connected with this movement. Some of them may sort of surprise you. If you've ever read Little Women, it's probably more of the girls out there, but growing up, Louisa May Alcott and her family were actually part of this group that gathered around. And there's a few other people that may or may not have been directly connected with the old mans in these evening meetings and conversations, but whose writings definitely picked up in this style. One of them is the poet Emily Dickinson. Now, Emily Dickinson became known as the Belle of Amherst, as they like to call her, but actually she was this really, really well-educated, well-connected, great family, but a total recluse. She had this fear of going out, and over the course of her life, from the time she was sort of an older teenager, she just didn't leave her house anymore. Now, people came to visit her, but she didn't go out. She never married. She lived alone. But we found that she always wrote to people, and after she died, they found thousands of these poems written on anything you can imagine, scraps of paper, envelopes, backs of napkins, and stuffed in closets, under the napkin, and in drawers, and just all over the house, that were found after her death. And these poems are these smaller and larger glimpses of life that really fit into this romanticism idea and this kind of philosophy. And then there's Walt Whitman, who started off as a more conventional poet. Particularly, he wrote a lot about the Civil War. And if you look at his early works, they're very structured and they look like the kinds of things that you would recognize as poetry. But then he started to get into this idea of really reinventing poetic forms. He blew the whole idea of organized verse out the window and had this blank verse and even free and open verse. Probably his most famous, well-known work is Leaves of Grass, which is this long, drawn-out series of poems and odes. He wrote these very intensely personal kinds of reflections, and it was all very experiential. It was rather controversial for the time because some of the things he wrote about were very sensual and very romantic, and he had this stunning language and imagery and an interesting, new and unique way of looking at the life and at the world. So we're going to take a look at some of Whitman's stuff through this unit and beyond as well. And so that's the end. Well, maybe not the end of everything if you're a transcendentalist and everything goes beyond, but at least for this particular presentation, this is the end of this. See you in class.